Hi everyone. Now that you've learned a little bit about what Presentation Zen is, we're going to take a moment to look at some actual examples of existing PowerPoints and how you would portray that information in a Presentation Zen type style. We're going to start with some slides that Dr. Hessling has already sent me that he would use in his class to look at what are some ways that we could Zen-like work on these. So this is a great one about the State Board of Education and how important it is and what it does and who makes up that State Board of Education. When I was looking at what are some ways that I could make this more visually appealing, I wanted to actually show an image of the person that's currently our superintendent of public instruction. And because it looked like the most important aspect of that was that this is an elected position, not just appointed. And then also the numbers. So looking at how many members, how many are ex officio, how many are appointed by the governor, and how that impacts the makeup of the board. I then added a second slide to talk more about what the board does, because those are two separate things that I would talk about. So when you're creating a presentation, you're really going to be thinking about how am I going to be explaining this information and what information will I be talking about at a time. I could, for instance, on this previous slide, done one about the superintendent and then done another about the makeup of the members of the state board. Another example is looking at these 4 questions that are looking at liability. And it's a lot of text, and I'm probably only going to be talking about one question at a time. So I'm going to introduce the topic of 4 big liability questions, and then I'm going to go ahead and on each slide have my own question. In this example, you'll see, did you act as a reasonably prudent teacher? This is an example of something, do I really need this information on the slide? Reasonably prudent teacher, RPT, might be something that's important for my students to get. However, on the third slide, I might say, you know what, this information is really what I'm going to need to be able to talk about this slide to my students. So I'm going to delete that, and instead of actually putting it on the slide itself, I'm going to put it in my notes. This means that it will remind me of what it is that I want to talk about with my students. If I give my students this handout or this PowerPoint to look at later, they'll still have all of these notes. But when I'm giving the actual presentation, it won't be distracting to my students while they're trying to read all the information that's up there on the slide. Another example is this one that looks at these key constitutional changes after the Civil War. Now, I could just be saying there are 3 key changes about the Civil War, and that's all I'm going to talk about. But what are some ways that I can make this more visually appealing? One, it's kind of hard to read with the picture of the Constitution in the background. It's got a theme that might be a little distracting, and everything is in all capitals. So what are some ways I could change that? Well, one of the things that I decided to do was kind of go horizontally rather than vertically and say we're going to talk about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. Now, I could say that I only really want to talk about one amendment at a time, and if that's the case, then I would go ahead and make its own slide. You'll also notice that I took the picture of the Constitution, I made it the background, but I kind of made the transparency a little less so it was easier to read. So depending on how I want to talk about this is really going to impact how I design my slides and how I go through that. And that should be what the focus of your presentation should be, is how am I really going to deliver this information? So if you decide to use the notes feature, it can be helpful to give your students the PowerPoint in a way that they can read the notes more effectively. What I like to do, under File, you'll go to Print Settings and Preview, and you'll see you've got a couple different options. This one's doing Slide without notes. What I'm actually going to do is do Slide with notes. And when you do Slide with notes, you'll see, so if we go down to the slide that we used, and we put notes on it, you'll see that those notes are going to come up underneath the slide. This is going to allow for your students to have the extensive notes that you might have, so if they've missed a class or if you want them to have it afterwards so they can study from it, they're still getting all that information, but it's not bombarding them while you're giving your presentation. Now I could print, but I can really just download as a PDF, and now I have my PowerPoint with those notes easy for my students to see.